Welcome to Cloudbreak, where breakthrough innovation meets breakthrough growth. Today, Chuck Stonecipher and Amy McCullough of Trilogy Equity Partners chat with Karl Stillner and Steve Dossick, co-founders of BrightCanary. BrightCanary uses AI to help parents guide, protect, and connect with their kids as they enter the digital world. Here's their conversation. Hello, Karl and Steve. Thanks for spending some time chatting with Amy and me this afternoon and talking about BrightCanary. Let's start with you briefly introducing both yourselves and just a little bit about the company.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Chuck and Amy. I'm Karl Stillner. I'm one of the co-founders of BrightCanary. I'm also the CEO. BrightCanary is a service that helps parents stay engaged with their kids' digital lives. I'm also the father of two. I have a soon-to-be 14-year-old boy and an 11-year-old boy. Steve?
And I'm Steve Dossick, also a co-founder and CTO, and also a father of two. I have twins who are going to be 16 next week and driving.
Lovely. Let's talk a little bit about how it began. What's the origin story behind the company?
Karl and I had a previous company that we did together called PushSpring that was also a Trilogy portfolio company. And we had kids kind of around the same period in our lives. My kids are a little bit older. But we'd constantly be talking about, they're starting to use iPads. How do you stop them from going to see the wrong thing on YouTube? And then it gets worse and worse as they get older because they get access to more and more stuff. And we sort of realized that there just wasn't any good technology for parents. There's command and control software, basically, that lets you say when they can use the device, what apps are they allowed to use, but really has no information for you about what it is they're doing inside those apps. So that was kind of the place that we started with BrightCanary, was to give parents more insight into what the kids are actually doing, as opposed to, hey, they used iMessage for 2 hours. Well, what did they do inside iMessage for 2 hours? What did they watch on YouTube? And so that's kind of where we started. And it's turned out that that's actually something that's resonating a lot with parents, thankfully for us.
Karl, anything you wanted to add on that?
No, I think Steve and I, we just sold our last business to T-Mobile. And so there was a lot of water cooler talk when we were at T-Mobile, and we were small company guys, or at least early stage entrepreneurs who like to build businesses. And being at T-Mobile, it was a great place to be, but we at the heart of it were itching to get back into the startup world. And as Steve pointed out, we were living and breathing this kind of reality of having kids that are growing up in the digital age, and frustrated as technologists that there weren't solutions that we could use that we thought were pragmatic for what was actually going on. And so that was really what inspired us both to want to get back into the early stage entrepreneurial venture area. And it's been great because we have beta testers with our own kids, and so it makes it much easier than if it's a theoretical. Like, we're living and breathing this every day. My kids are at the perfect age, being 14 and 11, that are really transitioning into this phase where they're using devices more and more and trying to help guide them. So not only am I living it at work, but living it at home as well.
And my kids constantly tell me how much their friends hate the software that we build. So that's great.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about your differentiation as a company, how you think about the competitive landscape and the market, and why BrightCanary now made sense versus existing solutions. Lots of parents who are listening probably are used to researching endless solutions or hoped for solutions. Talk a little bit about where you guys fit into that mix.
Yeah, as Steve pointed out earlier, we aren't focusing on blocking or preventing kids from accessing certain content like the first generation of solutions do. We just don't think that's a pragmatic approach in today's day and age. Kids have devices at school. They have devices, on the bus. They have devices everywhere. And so this notion of being able to prevent kids from using the internet is antiquated. I think that might have made sense 15, 20 years ago. It doesn't make sense today in 2025. And so instead, we're focused on keeping parents surprised of what the kids are doing. And to do that, you really have to be broad in terms of your ability to catch communications and content consumption across all services that kids are using, not just a subset. And so we use a different technology, a different technological approach than our competitors. And we actually use a couple of different solutions, which enables us to have a much bigger net, which makes it much more comprehensive than just using a VPN or just using an MDM like some of our competitors will. And it also allows us to really focus on iOS. In the US, 87% of kids use iOS devices. That's certainly not true internationally, but in the US, that's the reality. And the solutions that exist in the market today are really focused on Android because of the technology approaches they're using. And we realize that the kids are on iOS, and so you really need to have a solution for that market. And so we're unique in our ability to address that market comprehensively. Further, we started this 10 years later, 10, 15 years later than our competitors. And so for us, AI has been something we've been able to integrate into the product from the get-go. So it's not a bolt-on. It's not a nice to have that people are kind of throwing together after the product has been conceived of for a decade. This is something that's really integrated into the whole user experience.
For us, we kind of started the project just as LLMs were becoming kind of a thing. And that's really enabled us to do a great job in helping the parents understand what the kids are doing and what the content the kids are engaging with is all about. The previous generation of tools that did any kind of monitoring were using off-the-shelf machine learning models that would help categorize content as not safe for work, et cetera. Those models are really built to help large companies like someone like an Etsy or a Yelp who are hosting user-generated content to make sure that what was being uploaded wasn't porn. And that's great. That doesn't always work for the kind of content kids are getting into. When kids are reading and writing stuff online, they're using, basically snippets. They're not writing full sentences. The models are not trained on that kind of content. They don't work very well for kid language. Turns out that the LLMs, because they're just more fluid with written content, are much better able to understand the meaning and emotion behind communication that is written in snippets, kind of text message style. And so that's really been kind of a rocket, to power our product for the moms and the dads. It's a big differentiator for us that we're so focused on using LLMs to provide all of that processing.
You guys, you did talk about, the origin story being that you were, parents yourselves and, starting to sort of struggle with your own old children using devices and, sort of had an idea there that, there could be a solution there and maybe apply some technology to that. Talk a little bit about the journey between that idea and when you started to, get some feedback of it. Hey, we might actually have a solution here, and there might actually be some demand, outside our own personal households, for this solution. Talk about that sort of feedback loop and how that went over time. And
Yeah, in terms of the feedback loop, I don't think we were ever concerned that there was a market here. Look, Jonathan Haidt's book The Anxious Generation has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 67 weeks now. And so it's clear this is something that parents are struggling with. Any soccer game I go stand on the sideline of, any school event I go to, this is the number 1, 2, and 3 issue parents are talking about. So I don't think Steve or I ever had any doubt that there was a huge market here. I think the hard part for us was figuring out what part of the market to really attack. And we originally started with this notion of content, really focusing on the content that kids are consuming on the device, largely through YouTube and Google. And there's certainly demand for that. And I think parents are concerned about the content. But what we realized in the first year of the company's existence is that there's a lot more concern about the messaging that's going on between kids. That's unfiltered, that's unmoderated. Parents do not want to restrict that because they don't want their kid to become a social pariah. They want their kid to be integrated into social life. So they're not willing to say, hey, no, you're not able to use iMessage or you're not able to use whatever messaging platform. Instead, they realize that there's a huge need for parents to have visibility into what's going on in those communications. And that took us a good, 12, 15 months to figure out. And we heard that from customers, but it was something that we were not expecting. So I think it took probably the signal strength to be pretty strong for us to realize we really needed to pivot more aggressively into the messaging space than we had originally intended. And that was a different technology solution we had to build as a consequence of that, which took us a good 6 to 12 months. That was the most important learning for us in the first year or so, was this notion that messaging is really where the key concern is.
And that messaging is not only iMessage, right? Instagram is a messaging app. Snap is actually a messaging app, right? Even though they have features like Reels and things like that, where kids are posting, short snippets of video or photos or whatever. The actual content that's going on is what's going on in the direct messaging or the group messaging. And again, as Karl said, there's very good content moderation going on YouTube and on Instagram and on Snap even, to make sure that no overt pornography, for instance, is being posted, or nothing that's truly gore and, truly violent content. That's stuff is technically public content. Anybody can, unless it's a private account, anyone can go to any Instagram profile and see any content. The direct messages, though, are completely unmoderated by Meta in the case of Instagram. And same for Snap. If my son direct messages a group of friends from his school, no one at Snap is moderating anything going on there. And so it's kind of the Wild West. And as Karl said, no parent wants to stop their kid from communicating with their friends, right? And especially this really started during COVID, I think. My kids were at the exact age for this. They were just beginning to become kind of digital citizens as COVID happened. And so, of course, you're going to let them play Roblox online with whoever from their class because you want them to be connected in some way to someone. But then it's the Wild West. There's no moderation going on.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, during COVID, we saw digital use double. And it hasn't reverted back to the pre-COVID norms. So what's happened is parents started using the device, rightfully or understandably so, to help kids communicate and stay connected with their friends. But it's been incredibly hard to pull back on that. And as a consequence, you have kids using digital devices much more than their parents ever intended for them to use them. And we see upwards of 6-7 hours a day of non-school related digital use, which is the majority of time the kid is awake outside of school. And just to put, a little more emphasis on this, it's really hard to be a parent if you have no idea of what your kid is doing in the majority of time they're out of school.
To put some numbers on it, the average kid on our platform is sending and receiving over 1,000 messages a day. So,
Yeah, wow.
To all their friends. So that'll just show you they're typing a lot and they're reading a lot. And before tools like ours, parents had no idea what was going on.
One follow on, why don't you talk just a little bit about what have you learned about the universality of parents looking for these solutions? Is it folks in San Francisco and in Seattle, sort of digital native parents, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, we had a hypothesis when we launched this business that it was going to be more concentrated on tech workers, people who have insight into the problem from their own professional path, potentially. High household income, high disposable income. These are the type of things we thought would be
trying to solve a problem they'd created, basically.
Right. And what we've learned is it's really much, much broader, this problem, than that. In fact, if anything, that particular segment under indexes, and we see much more over indexing in the Midwest, in the South, across faith-based organizations, across military backgrounds, et cetera. And so it's really broad. As many people pointed out, this is a bipartisan issue. It's not political, which is really nice.
Right.
Hopefully that actually drives some policy change as well. But it means that our customer base is extremely broad. And it's not just the U.S. as well, of course. This is an international problem as well. I think the U.S. is kind of at the forefront of it because I think kids got devices earlier than most places, but it's coming for the rest of the world, unfortunately.
Let's talk a little bit about your learnings as entrepreneurs in terms of building a company second time around, successful business. So lots of folks who are aspiring entrepreneurs or just starting on the journey think about, how do I use the right culture into my early stage company? How do I build the right team in those first early hires? And what are the hacks you guys are using with regards to your development process with a small team, tools that you're using, tricks of the trade that would be helpful to other entrepreneurs?
You want us to give away all the secrets?
Yes.
I mean, come on.
Share for the greater good, Steve. Yes.
Well, first, you don't sleep a lot. That's the first thing you do. 3 hours a night maximum, is kind of what you're looking at. No, I'm joking. So as I mentioned before, Karl and I had a previous business that was successful. And he said, as he mentioned, we sold it to T-Mobile and we learned a lot of things there. We had both done startups before as well. So we've both done multiple of these sort of journeys. And our last company, we sort of formalized and we've kind of continued it here, even though we're still a very small team. We have kind of a no asshole policy. For instance, I have a set of engineers that I've worked with over the years. I've been doing this now for 26 years. I have a set of engineers who I call the smartest engineers I'll never work with again because they're just impossible people, right? Brilliant, right? But will ruin the team because no one will want to work with them. And so we don't hire anybody like that, for instance. I think it's also helpful for everyone to understand the mission really, really deeply. The majority of the people who work for us have kids. Not everybody, but even the ones who don't have kids yet, like we just hired someone who has a sister who has multiple kids, right, and is very involved with those kids. And so, I think that's really helpful. You have to have someone who's aligned with the mission of what you're trying to do here because it really is kind of a mission, right? Where we can't pay as well as Amazon can. right? We work harder than they do in a lot of ways. We're more flexible in a lot of ways, but if they're not aligned with the mission, they're not going to be able to do this long term.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our last business, of course, was before COVID, and this business has been entirely post-COVID. Obviously, remote work has become more of a tool and impediment as well. And so it's easier to find great talent, and that has been a huge benefit to us. But it's also harder to build culture when you have everyone remote or most people remote. And so that's been something that it's been new for us to figure out. We still consistently, as Steve pointed out, hire the best people we possibly can, and we give them a lot of room to run. Like we don't micromanage. We have few meetings. One of the benefits we can offer people coming from an Amazon is you're not going to have your calendar totally constrained by meetings back to back all day. And so we do that. We provide, we give people lots of room to maneuver. We provide a lot of trust, and it seems to work out well, but it's, that's admittedly harder to do when you're trying to scale the team very aggressively. Fortunately, our business right now doesn't require hundreds and hundreds of employees. And so I'm not sure we'll ever get to that point because of how scalable inherently the business is. But I think that is a challenge if you're trying to grow really fast. We do get together in person twice a year. I'd like to do that more often. I think it's important just to have that face-to-face and establish trust and a rapport with people over dinners and the like.
Hiring developers is always really difficult for startups, especially if you're in a place like Seattle where they can go work at any number of large companies that will pay them sort of ungodly amounts of money. And have stock that is immediately tradable once it's vested, unlike ours. And so we've been successful finding people who have kind of what I call alternative backgrounds that generally will get overlooked by those companies. So you find someone who has, for instance, an undergrad degree from UW in physics, learned how to do a lot of programming doing that because you have to do that these days to do that kind of degree, but was not formally trained in CS and instead did a 6-month kind of coding boot camp about 5 years ago. Then worked at a sort of mid-size engineering organization and, learned how to be a developer professionally, but could not get arrested by a recruiter at Amazon or at Microsoft. He's great, right? He's our newest employee. He's fantastic. He's, fitting right in. We like to hire people who want to work on lots of different things as opposed to kind of specializing in one thing. And so someone like that who is just kind of early in the career and trying to understand all the different things they could focus on, they can get exposed to a lot of different pieces. We have mobile, we have backend, we have database stuff. We have huge data scale issues because of the amount of data we're collecting and processing for kids. We have data security issues because it's kids' data. So, we make it a very interesting place as well as, recruiting people who are kind of ready to go on a different journey.
I'll ask a follow-up question here in the business building category. As you had mentioned, we worked with you guys on your last business, which was a B2B business. This time around, you're building a B2C business. That's not often the case. I think that entrepreneurs, Steve's laughing, the entrepreneurs, move from B2B or to B2C or vice versa. Talk a little bit about what you've learned, or maybe I should say what you're learning with that different business model, if you will.
I think we've learned that the phrase "how hard could it be" is maybe not one you should use.
I mean, it's a fair point, Chuck, to point out that our last business was an entirely different ecosystem. When we went into it, we knew nothing about advertising technology. It was a totally new ecosystem, and I think Steve and I both enjoy a challenge. And we like building something that's new and innovative for a category. And we did that at PushSpring. And I think actually having no knowledge of the ad tech ecosystem helped us because we just built what made sense. We weren't encumbered by all the baggage associated with that ecosystem. And there's certainly a lot of it. And so we just built something that made sense. And it happened to make sense for lots of people at agencies who were buying and were relatively new in the ad tech ecosystem themselves. They just wanted tools that were useful. And so when we were thinking about launching another business, I think we'd certainly realized that B2C is inherently very different. And launching an app business in 2022 is very difficult, especially given all the attribution issues that have come down the pike. So the level of difficulty is extremely high, but I think we both view that as a challenge. And also, to Steve's earlier point, this is we have a mission approach here. This is mission based. And so that makes all these challenges a lot more palatable. We get feedback from parents all the time that we're helping them raise their kids, and that we've averted all kinds of terrible situations because of our offering. And that, I think is really inspiring for us. So that's been, I think, part of the enticement for going into B2C, but it's entirely different in many ways. I mean, the brand obviously matters a lot more. There's a much bigger focus on marketing, on spending to get customers in. The economics of the business are oftentimes upside down for many, many years before it actually makes sense, which is something that was inherently very hard for both Steve and I to get our head around, because we're used to, our last business was EBIT positive for the last few years of its existence before it was bought. And to us, that's kind of the natural place a business should be. And so this notion of having a business that isn't profitable for many years is new to us. But you also understand this is the game that almost every B2C business has played in the tech space has done this. So we're learning as we go, but it's certainly been a rough education in many ways. But I think we're both learning quickly, which we enjoy.
I like how ultimately you tied it back to the mission, right? Hey, that just falls out of what we're trying to do here. Yep. We didn't choose to do a B2C business.
That's right.
We chose to go solve a problem on a mission to solve that problem, and this model comes out of that.
One of the things that makes it even harder is, in our last business, we were fortunate in that we were selling a slightly different version because it was kind of a mobile focused data product, but it was something that our customers who were ad agencies bought regularly. So they had budgets. We just showed up and we said, hey, we have this slightly different thing. We have these great tools to work with it. And they all kind of glommed onto it and loved it. In this universe, we know there's a problem, right? As Karl said, Jonathan Haidt's book been on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year and almost a year and a half now. But there isn't like a category winner in this space that has.
You're not stealing share from somebody.
No. And it's not like we're coming into something where 100 million people have bought something and now we have a new, better version of it. This is kind of also market making, which is difficult, to say the least.
You talked about, sort of starting out focusing on thinking the solution had to be around content, YouTube, Google, that sort of stuff, and then sort of have the aha moment about, hey, it's about messaging, right? At least a big part of it's about messaging, and have spent, some time now, getting that part of the solution in place. As you look forward, what's next?
I think that the one thing that's become apparent in the last couple of years is kids have become much more savvy about the costs associated with digital overuse. I think 5 years ago, as parents, were totally blind to this notion that there was a lot of hidden costs, hidden at the time at least, associated with getting on a device for 6 hours, whether it's social media or whatever it may be. That's gone. Parents are aware of it now. There's awareness across that ecosystem. Kids are aware of it as well. They become much, much more savvy in the last couple of years about the price that's being paid. And we view that as an opportunity because we serve kids, parents of kids, let's call it age 8 to, let's call it roughly 16. As kids get into the 13, 14, 15-year-old range, there's more need for autonomy, and we think there's an opportunity to provide kids with tools that help them navigate the digital world without their parents. Right? This notion of having something that's AI driven, that's fully context aware of everything that's going on in the kid's digital life, I think it's extremely powerful. And I think puts a lot more trust and agency back with the kids, which I think they're asking for. And so we view that as a huge opportunity to have a product that's really designed for parents of kids age 8 to, let's call it 13, 14. And then they graduate into a service that really has them in the driver's seat. And it provides them with kind of this companion that is trusted, objective, and private to them as well. And so I think that's a huge area of interest for us that we're exploring.
Yeah, interesting. You wonder, couldn't all of us perhaps use a little bit of that in our digital lives, right?
Absolutely. I don't think anyone ages out of that. I could use that. I think anyone could use that. And so I don't think it's confined to that. It's just an interesting point when the kids are fledging, right? They're getting out of the nest, and that's a good opportunity to provide them with some help, and they'll probably continue using it. At least a large percentage of them would.
These interviews are always a mixed bag of questions, but there's always something that we forget. So what did we not ask you that you would like to mention, either to prospective BrightCanary parents who are considering your service, to entrepreneurs who are thinking about taking the leap, to other investors who you might meet down the road? What do you want to say?
Well, I think one of the obvious things is entrepreneurs need to have fun doing this. It's far too stressful to do without having a notion of enjoying it. And Steve and I have worked together for a long time, and so we have the benefit of having a long-term relationship. We understand how each other work, and we also, I think, appreciate each other's sense of humor. And I think that helps a lot. And I think it's really hard if you're a sole founder not to have someone along the journey with you, especially someone that you see eye to eye with. And so I think it's really important to find someone you can work with to make the journey a lot less lonely and a lot more enjoyable.
I think that's the case also on the investor side. Not to sound too much like a trilogy shill around here, but I mean,
that's okay. You can be a little bit of it.
All right, a little bit. There's a reason that we came back to you guys, right? I mean, I've done, this is actually the 6th startup that I've been involved with over my ridiculous career. I can tell you some hair-raising stories about investors and what they have done to companies that I've been involved with. Trilogy is not that, right? Trilogy is pretty amazing to work with. So we feel like friends and partners, not adversaries.
Yep.
Agreed. Steve.
Appreciate that. A few lightning round questions here at the end. If you guys could send your a text message back to yourselves back in time, on the day you were just starting out, what would you and the answer can't be, for God's sake, don't do this.
There it is.
That's a good caveat, because that was going to be my
Yes, all right.
I'm joking.
What do you wish you could have texted yourself?
It's going to take longer than you think.
Yeah.
I mean, we haven't got into tons of detail on our product, but we're basically in the kind of the 3rd iteration of our product now. And, it's not like we've thrown away pieces and we don't have them anymore. I mean, we started with content. We still have, more than half of our users are using YouTube and Google search moderation that we offer. The 2nd generation was the first step into messaging, where we became the only product on the market that can really monitor iMessage. And now we've recently released a 3rd version kind of the app that, in addition to those 2 things, also offers the ability to monitor everything the kid is typing on their device by installing some software on the device itself. And so this is 3 turns of the crank, and it's really 3 re-envisionings of the whole. And I think each piece kind of builds on the others, incorporates everything we've learned about what's important and what the parents really want. And that newest version has only been out for a few weeks. Early returns are kind of, ridiculously positive from my perspective. Obviously, we still have some bugs and issues to work out, but yeah, I mean, it's going to take longer than you think.
It's funny you came up with that, Steve, because mine was very similar. It was, don't rush the product market fit phase and getting the product right. If we were being self-critical, I think we kind of came out of the gate really aggressively before we had that fully locked in. And I think we could have used a little more patience in the very early days in terms of our go-to-market, because obviously the go-to-market will be that much easier if you've nailed the product market fit and you have the product coming. And I think we were trying to do too many things at once at the very beginning.
You already mentioned, as 2nd-time founders, the importance of partnership. Partnership both between yourselves and maybe a little bit with your investors as well. Anything else is sort of the 2nd time go around, as Amy alluded to, sort of 1st-time founders out there, that, lessons that folks should watch out for.
Yeah, I mean, I think Steve already alluded to it, finding a good partner with your investor. I think there's a lot of first-time entrepreneurs who focus on the key financial terms in a fundraise. What's the valuation, et cetera, versus who am I going to be working with? Who are the individuals I'm going to be working with? Not necessarily even the firm, but the individuals who will be around the table with me, and making that the first priority and the financials the second priority. It's worked out well for us, and I've heard others as well say similar things.
I think it's also something you have to understand. Like Karl and I focus on different parts of a business, right? So when we've been through this, like the full cycle in our last company, so we know how this goes. This early part of the business is much more, it's much more difficult, I think. And I think you would agree with, for me, than it is for him, in the sense that, like, I'm running the team that's building the product here, and is also running all the infrastructure and trying to figure out what we should go build next. That flips around, because if the product is successful, probably within the next, year or so, as we start to get to the point where things are stable enough and we have enough users that we are out trying to get partnerships with folks, et cetera, that all falls in Karl's universe. And I'm not going to be the one on planes every other week flying to different places to do meetings with big companies, right? So it's sort of, there's a natural rhythm to this. I think something that, so if you haven't done this before, if you have a co-founder who's not, sort of an identical skill set to yours, you have to realize that there's going to be different contributions at different times from different folks.
Well, and being wise that transition is going to happen over time, and building a team from the start that is built for that to happen, right? sort of speaks to ultimately to sort of scalability, I think, of the team a little bit. Let's conclude here. What are you guys, paying attention to out there? What's interesting that you're watching, that you're reading, that you're sort of listening to, that's sort of either informing the business you're building or just maybe more importantly entertaining you, so you can get some relaxation when you're not thinking about the business.
Yeah, well, having a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old makes it hard to find a lot of free time for pleasure reading or watching. I am reading or attempting to read. I read about 2 pages a night before I pass out. A book called The Organized Mind, and it's written by a neuroscientist, and it's talking about how we all are confronting information overload and how our brains are ill-equipped to actually handle that from an evolutionary standpoint. So it's obviously relevant for our work, but I find it fascinating from a personal perspective as well, because I think we're all struggling with it, especially as you age, and there's just more and more stimuli, more inputs coming. So I'm finding that to be somewhat useful. I'm listening to a podcast right now that is the founder of Whoop. I think his name's Will Ahmed, and he's talking about the early days of Whoop and how they intentionally limited the product so they wouldn't have unintentional product scope creep. They didn't have a screen on the device. They still don't have a screen on the device because they didn't want to become a wearable watch. And it's been really interesting to listen to how they thought about building a business for a very specific segment, and that was hardcore endurance athletes. And then how they're kind of gradually expanding after they've done that for many, many years. I like watching Seinfeld with my kids. They enjoy that. And then for a laugh, I always like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which I view as like a darker version of Seinfeld.
I mentioned at the beginning that my kids are going to be driving as of next week officially on their own. So in an attempt to sort of connect with them, because, when they're 16, they don't want to talk to you anymore unless they're asking you for money. They actually showed me that there's a subreddit called Idiots in Cars, which is basically people doing really stupid things on the road. And so it's the sort of don't do that, please, So that's our nightly look at this.
Well, guys, thanks so much for being generous with your time this afternoon. It's been great chatting with you, Sam, and more importantly, been great being partners with you on the BrightCanary journey.
Yeah, well, thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys. You bet.
Thanks, guys.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Cloudbreak. To learn more about BrightCanary, visit brightcanary.io. If you're building something amazing and want to learn more about Trilogy Equity Partners, visit us at trilogyequity.com. If you liked what you heard today, subscribe, rate, review, and/or share this podcast with your friends. Until next time.